You're listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, a production company specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Alamo Pictures to be the first to hear about new productions, festivals we're attending, and how to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk. And now, enjoy Factual America with our host, Matthew Sherwood.
Welcome to Factual America, a podcast that explores the themes that make America unique through the lens of documentary filmmaking. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood, and each episode it is my pleasure to interview documentary filmmakers and experts on the American experience. Today we're going to talk about a topic or topics that is never far away, probably gets alluded to in all our podcasts, but this will be the first time we deal with it head on, and that's race and politics in the U.S. And our guest will be actually something he's been talking about in a lot of his writings, increasingly racially polarized politics in the U.S. So without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Richard Johnson to the podcast. He's a lecturer in U.S. Politics and International Relations at the University of Lancaster. So welcome.
Thank you very much.
He's written extensively on race and U.S. politics. His latest book is The End of the Second Reconstruction, Obama, Trump, and the Crisis of Civil Rights. That is supposed to come out in 2020. Now, we don't know exactly when this is going to get published, but I could say next year, and that would give you a year's grace. But we'll be talking more about a chapter from your book. I think we should make a reference to the fact that I think it's pretty safe to say you called the UK election, which we had a little over a week ago, and he's just off an appearance on CNN to talk about the Trump impeachment. So it's been quite a busy 7 to 8 days here in London. So is there anything else I should add, Richard? Maybe you can tell quickly some of the other, your specialties and things you're working on.
Yeah, so most of my research centers around race and American politics, and particularly I sort of say race and American democracy, because I think that racial inclusion in the United States is essential to the vibrancy of democracy in the United States. The two can't be seen as separate. So in addition to the book, which is really about civil rights enforcement in American democracy, I've also been writing more specifically about voting rights and the enforcement or non-enforcement of the Voting Rights Act at different intervals in its more than 50 years of history. Okay.
Well, without further ado, I think we, as our listeners know, the way we rock and roll here at Factual America is that we always have a documentary film as a backdrop, and this time around, we have an incredible film. I highly recommend it to everyone. It's I Am Not Your Negro, directed by Raoul Peck, who is a Haitian. He's actually a minister of culture in the 1990s in the Haitian government. He was Best Documentary Academy Award, nominated for that, and actually won the BAFTA. And I've got an A.O. Scott quote from the New York Times I think it's worth reading here. Whatever you think about the past and future of what used to be called race relations, this movie will make you think again and may even change your mind. So, why did you choose this film? Or we kind of chose it together, but why do you think this is appropriate to what the work you've been doing?
Well, what I like about Baldwin is that he is able to speak about the long political development of the United States, but in ways which are quite arresting and, particularly for the white audiences to whom he often spoke were designed to shake people out of their comfort. And I think that in the work that I do in my academic scholarship, I see a lot of what I try to do is trying to shake people out of their comfort, to look at the United States in comparative perspectives, to dismantle particular claims of American exceptionalism, which have run so deeply. So I think Baldwin, I look at it from a kind of institutional perspective. I think Baldwin looks at it in a more sort of philosophical perspective, which I find very valuable as well.
Okay. And I think it's all very interesting, very in line with, as some will know, Alamo Pictures is a sponsor of this podcast and often makes documentaries about the U.S. from a European perspective. And I think this combination of a Haitian director, Baldwin, who himself spent a lot of time in France, or most of his life in France, and then in his own keen observations, in some ways more about the U.S. itself and rather than race specifically. So for those who haven't seen the film, and it came out in 2016, can you give us a brief synopsis of what this film's about?
Well, it uses the words of Baldwin, and really it's sort of based on a book that Baldwin never finished, which was going to be a book about three friends of his, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King, who all were murdered in the 1960s, civil rights leaders, and all really quite young. I mean, it's amazing to think not a single one of those three men lived to be 40 years old. And I think Baldwin was going to try to use their lives and deaths as a way of speaking more generally about the United States and its relationship with race. And he never really got beyond a sort of 30 pages of notes, and those notes then formed the basis of this film. And so the entire film are Baldwin's words, both from his writings, these notes, and also his speaking appearances and television appearances throughout his life. But what is also, I think, a wonderful thing that the director has done here is been able to has added so many other layers to that. So he's added more contemporary imagery of the Black Lives Matter struggle and so on. But also I think there's this huge unspoken kind of commentary underlying it of the kind of popular culture of the United States, American film, American music, advertising, the media, and so the film is also interspersed with all these sort of images of the kind of heroics of the American West as it was portrayed in cowboy films, and the the insulting way that African Americans were portrayed in early American film and so on. So it's, in one sense, it's an attempt to complete and finish Baldwin's book, but also brings in so much more than I think even the Baldwin notes themselves contain.
Yes, and I think a part of that is I hadn't realized, and Peck draws it out, and probably through those if it's all from those 30 pages of notes, what a rich 30 pages it is. In that Baldwin himself made references to films a lot.
Yes.
So growing up, what were the images he was seeing when he was growing up? Who were the positive or lack of positive black role models that he had? And even contemporary films of his time. And I think very interestingly, there's even one where he's saying, well, white audiences saw it this way, but if you were sitting in a film theater and cinema in Harlem, you could have heard the black community saying something very different. So I think it's extremely well done. And as you say, also with the current news footage and other imagery. I mean, one thing I picked up on was, and I think Baldwin even makes reference, it's not just the U.S., he even there's some lines in there about Western society in general. And one of the images, because he shows a lot of advertising images from an era of how African Americans were depicted, and I noticed that one of them was a Jay Sainsbury's ad, actually. So it's not even a U.S.-based image. But I think, with that in mind, I think what would be good is to maybe at this point just kind of dive right in terms of a little bit of history. That's certainly what Baldwin's about. He was like, you have to look at the whole arch of history. You can't just look at the last few decades. He makes a lot of references to 400 years, on. And so I think for those listening across the globe who may not know American history as detailed, certainly as you, and I certainly my cursory knowledge is, so maybe talk to us, maybe, I don't know, where do we start? But maybe a good starting point is the end of the American Civil War and what is called Reconstruction, in which you refer to as the first Reconstruction.
Yeah. So to put that into context, I side with a group of scholars who view the United States as, at best, a middle-aged democracy, not particularly, especially long-standing democracy, a country that could be, in comparative terms, understood as a democracy for about five decades or so. And the reason for that is because the kind of elemental features of democracy, multi-party competition, free assembly and speech, access to a meaningful vote, were denied to millions of Americans until the 1960s. And the one exception to that long period of race-based exclusion to American democracy was the decade after the American Civil War, which was known as Reconstruction, a word that Abraham Lincoln used in the last speech that Lincoln gave before he was killed.
Yeah.
Lincoln called in that speech for a reconstruction of American democracy on new terms. And it's in that speech that Lincoln, for the first, and as it turned out, the only time in his life, called for the vote to be extended to African Americans. And so that decade ended up being an incredible decade where 2,000 African Americans were elected to public offices throughout the country. You had black mayors, black senators and congressmen, black lieutenant governors. You had the acting governor of Louisiana was the son of a slave. And what's so important about that period is not just the election of people who became part of the black elite, but also the grassroots engagement of ordinary African Americans in that period, which was profound. You had the Republican Party of the South was made up of thousands of ordinary African Americans who showed untold bravery in things like wearing Ulysses Grant badges and pins to work when they were working as cleaners and
he was the Republican nominee and then later president.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
and then he was a hated figure by the white South, but these African Americans in the South, bravely supported him, and they came under untold violence for it. And that's then the next important thing about Reconstruction is the important thing about Reconstruction is not just that it happened, but that it ended, and that it ended in a dramatic fashion. And in my book, I write about a black congressman from Florida who made some of the first speeches in Congress calling for federal funding for public education. But when he died in 1905, he died without even the right to vote. By that point, African Americans had been disenfranchised in Florida, and there was no obituary even published for him when he died. And so what's important from that understanding of that history is about the fragility of democracy. And that's true all around the world, but it's also very true in America. And I think that one of the things that Baldwin recognized was that this story of democracy is not some kind of Whiggish teleology of ever expanding. You hear a lot of people say that this is a journey of the more perfect union, and it's always a kind of step forward march to progress. But actually, America had one instance of multiracial democracy, at least male democracy in the 19th century, that collapsed, and so therefore, when we think about democracy in America today, I think we should also not think that it is impenetrable.
Well, that's interesting. I think the what I find very interesting is also the grassroots comments, because I can tell you, as someone who born and raised in the United States, certainly one side of my family's from the South. The other side's from Texas, but we don't consider ourselves part of the South because we like to forget our history. And there were all a bunch of Germans that came afterwards. But anyway, it's always been sort of portrayed as Reconstruction was almost this top-down sort of, the North came in, picked some black African Americans, put them in office, and then once they pulled back, because we haven't even mentioned Rutherford B. Hayes. I never thought I'd mention him in a podcast or any kind of conversation, to be honest. But once that compromise was made, that was it. But you're saying that there was more to it than they had more legs to it than that. It wasn't just something that was enforced upon the population.
That's right, and the reason why we can be pretty confident that Reconstruction was a mass movement of democracy in the South was that after the compromise of 1876, when the Republican elites in Washington agreed to remove federal troops from the South who had been providing physical protection for people to be able to vote. When Rutherford B. Hayes was the beneficiary of that and became president, that efforts of what we might still see as grassroots efforts of democracy persisted for another 2 decades. And African-American newspapers, which were of a political nature, were still being published. They were still running for office. And really what brought Reconstruction to an end was a really profound violence which occurred in the South, and that the rise of lynchings in the 1890s is not unconnected with the end of Reconstruction.
I mean, I saw in your book you make mention, I think, because something I didn't know until many years ago, I lived in the state of North Carolina, and there was a paper that had an article that I read one time about this sort of connection between black Republicans and white populists in a lot of these areas, and coming up against it's hard for people to believe now, given how the parties are aligned, but coming up against a democratic machine, and those machines controlled the newspapers, and so obviously all the press and the PR, if you will, or propaganda in another way, and they just got stomped down.
And that's one of the things also that I want to try and do in my book is to show that actually there were pockets of success of an alliance between working class whites and working class African Americans in the South. Even after the elite politicians in Washington had kind of abandoned the project. So, there was a general strike in New Orleans at the end of the 19th century, and that was a general strike that was coordinated between both black and white unions. And in the 1890s in states like North Carolina and in Alabama, that this fusion of the white working class populists and the black Republicans actually saw a degree of political success. And it was then when the kind of white supremacist democratic machine then actually, that's when they pushed back with the greatest levels of violence.
Okay. So I know we'll get to there's this second Reconstruction that a lot of people talk about. But before we do that, I think there's so many, as I was mentioning before, I'd almost like to show the whole film as one big giant clip. I highly recommend people watching it, especially for Baldwin. I can't find it's basically his observations. I wanted to say they're more than bon mots, they're more than truisms. It's just his very keen observations about not just race but American society. But at the very beginning of the film, it starts off with a very young Dick Cavett. For those of you who don't know, he's a talk show host. Dick Cavett show was sort of it was kind of the intellectuals talk show, if you will, of the 60s and 70s. And it was still a talk show, chat show, but he would, in this, we see later in that same clip, he brings on a professor in philosophy from Yale to have a debate. People were actually having debates on TV. I don't think that can happen anymore. But he asks James Baldwin a question. And this is the question and then James's answer.
You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Alamo Pictures to keep up to date with new releases and upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. And now, back to Factual America.
So welcome back to Factual America. So we had that clip of Dick Cavett and interviewing James Baldwin, and you've also had a little break. So welcome back to the show. I think what I would like to almost flip that around. And in that clip, Dick says, look, there's black sports stars, you've got politicians, he even kind of jokes, and James Baldwin even smiles about you're even allowed to be in TV commercials. So why are you optimistic? And we've seen there that James is not especially optimistic. So maybe this is a good point for you to go kind of give us a little bit of because this does happen. This interview happens right in the middle of what I guess would be called the Second Reconstruction. And then we can then go from there in terms of what has changed since that period. So when did it start? How long is it? And then how did it start being deconstructed?
So the first Reconstruction kind of fell at two levels. First, it fell in the 1876 Compromise, and then really at the start of the 20th century, even the grassroots activism had really been snuffed out. And it's really then in the 1950s and 1960s that we then see the revival of federal commitment to enforcing the citizen rights of African Americans in a material way. And we see in the film actually, examples of, the federal government, much like after the Civil War, had to occupy parts of its own country in order to ensure civil rights were enforced. The day that James Meredith, an African American student, was admitted to the University of Mississippi, there were 31,000 U.S. troops mobilized in northern Mississippi in 1962, I think it was, to enable Meredith to go to his university, which was more than was stationed at the time on the Korean Peninsula. And so what we're seeing at this time when Baldwin's being interviewed by Dick Cavett is, there's potentially great deal of optimism here that the federal government is showing that renewed strength that it hasn't really been seen since the days of Ulysses Grant. And I guess, Baldwin is aware, he doesn't spell it out as in specific historical terms, but I think he's aware of the fragility of these moments and the conditionality, I think, as well. I think he's very suspicious of the depth of the commitment, and he's very critical of Bobby Kennedy throughout the film as well, which is very interesting.
He is. I don't think they like each other, or didn't like each other. But no, I think that's a very good point. There's and so you would say that then, so if people are, many listeners will be, it's well before their time, but well aware of the 50s and 60s, but that impact had lasted in the 70s and 80s. I know in the chapter I've read, and I was aware of this, that administrations of both political parties, it was sort of seamless, really, renewing the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act at different times. So it sort of seemed incontroversial. So I think this gets to a point where maybe when did this start? In your view, when did this start changing?
Yeah, so one of the things this second Reconstruction has apparently lasted much longer than the first, and the reason for that, or one of the reasons, is that there did seem to be a bipartisan consensus for it in a way that didn't exist in the first Reconstruction, where the Democratic Party in the first Reconstruction never accepted Reconstruction. And something like the Voting Rights Act has been renewed under multiple administrations, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, all signed extensions and strengthenings of the Voting Rights Act. And then it seems to have unraveled, perhaps with a kind of bitter irony, I think during the Obama administration. And I think that's when we start to see a real intensification of a kind of what I call a racially polarized partisanship, which was always present to some extent, but I think the levels of it have gone off the charts since Obama was elected.
Now, do you? So you start off your chapter that I've read with the 2010 midterms. Now, and in different places through each chapter, it's sort of it's not even a dotted line. You draw a pretty strong line that it's sort of some of these reactions, the Democrats did very poorly in 2010, and you look at sort of the racial elements of this, but 2010 was also a reaction to Obamacare, wasn't it? I mean, is it that cut and, I mean, in your view, is it that cut and dry? Is it purely a racial issue, or do you think there are many other factors that are kind of feeding in?
I mean, I think race suffuses so many of these issues that it's hard to take out what is race and what isn't. And I guess that's also one of the things I admire about Baldwin, is that that he doesn't view kind of race relations as some kind of external thing, that it's endogenous to all of these other issues. I think including the reaction to the healthcare law, that it was ultimately the Medicaid expansion which would have assisted African Americans the most, was the part of the legislation which was most strongly objected to and was blocked through the Supreme Court, or was blocked through Republican governors with the aid of the Supreme Court, and nearly all of these were in the South, and half of African Americans lived in states where their governors blocked the Medicaid expansion, which would have provided them with government-provided health care. So, even something like that, I think it's hard. I don't like to sort of say one issue is a racial issue and one issue is a non-racial issue. I think that there are racial dimensions to all issues in a way.
I think this might be a good, again, as I said, there's about many clips I'd like to play from this film, but I think this might be a good point to just show the clip where I've got it labeled here as not a racial problem. It's not really what Baldwin's saying, but he is saying that it's going to take much more than just a Voting Rights Act or a Civil Rights Act to make changes, and I think then that actually kind of plays into what you're saying. So let's have a quick look at that clip. That's a very good clip. If there were others we had time to watch or listen to, throughout the film, especially about middle of the way through, and this is the director doing it, I would say, a lot of references to, say white America, but certainly a majority of Americans not being, having a public and private life, not actually as a population. It kind of gets to issues of, we've discussed on the show before, America Dream, these sort of things. There is a stated view of what everyone wants, yet an inability to deal with the fact that most of us aren't able to achieve it, or at least what we were told we should be wanting. I think he mentions the house and picket fence and the Plymouth. Not that anyone's driving a Plymouth anymore, but the equivalent. And I think that's where I think it kind of brings us to a point where you've written about it. Your racially polarized partisanship. If you look at the parties now versus where in the 90s, they were much closer to, the Republicans are always a little bit whiter than the Democrats were, a little less white, as to put it crudely. Now, Republicans are 19 percentage points wider than what the demographic average would be for the U.S. The Democrats are 15 points less. What is that thing? There's a question that was polled. Is racism the main issue? Holding black, it was something to that effect. Racism is the main issue that's a stumbling block to blacks or black achievement or something to that effect. I'm not stating it very well, but Republicans say only 14% agree. You've got Democrats at 64%. So you've got two parties for a country where, and we've dealt with it here in the UK and a lot of other Western democracies, where sometimes the two main parties don't really differentiate themselves very much. That's quite a big difference. So, what is you're analyzing this now, and I think what's great about the work you're doing is it's a real focus on contemporary. I think a lot of scholars, if I may say, kind of get still stuck in the 60s on a lot of this stuff. Where do you see this heading? What is where we are today, and what does it look? Is this inevitable? Is it just going to carry on? What do you think? Is there going to be a backlash? What is the future?
Well, I do think that now that the parties have polarized so much on these kinds of questions, that it puts the civil rights infrastructure of the Second Reconstruction in grave peril. And I think that it's already, the Voting Rights Act has already been substantially diminished, and we could be seeing more cases down the line that could really spell the death knell of that act, which I think is the most important piece of civil rights legislation in American history. The question of, I don't think anything is inevitable, but I think we end up on these kind of path-dependent directions, which means that it becomes harder and harder to reverse track, and they become kind of reinforcing. I think a lot of people looked at the Obama election and saw that as this kind of great wave of white people finally voting for an African American. But Obama's re-election, he received the lowest share of the white two-party vote of any successfully elected president as long as records have begun. So his success was attributable to his ability to mobilize non-white Americans at historically high levels of turnout and support. The question of whether that is sustainable for the Democrats, though, is an open question. I don't know. Is there another candidate that can do that like Obama?
Because they say, people like to say demographics is destiny, and I'm aware of, even 10, 20 years ago, Democratic strategists saying, just looking at the demographic trends and saying, in some ways getting lazy, I would argue, saying, well, if we bide our time, even Texas is going to go for the Democrats in the near future. I think, as you point out in your research, that there's not just white flight from the cities, but there's white flight from parties, and that is happening faster in the Democratic Party than the less whitening or darkening, however you want to put it, of the American demographics. So, if anything, the Democrats are heading for further and further losses, certainly in the short to medium term.
Yeah, and this racially polarized partisanship, or white flight from the Democratic Party, as I've also called it, it's already happened in some parts of the country in a dramatic fashion. Obama only got 10% of the white vote in some of the Deep South states. So this, I think, a lot of people look at the changing demographics of the United States. A lot of that's caused by Hispanic migration to the United States, and I think that's a more complicated story. The African American population is staying about the same, and the question of whether the Latino population in the United States will become as a robust ally of African Americans, electorally speaking, is, I still think, an open question. Trump did no worse among Latino voters than Mitt Romney did, for example, and there's some evidence to suggest that he did marginally better because the Latinos who vote in America are Latino citizens, and they're going to have perhaps different views than non-citizen Latinos in the United States. So there are all sorts of complications there, and I think you're absolutely right that it's lazy. There is a laziness in just assuming that as the country becomes less non-Hispanic white, that then there is salvation there for the endurance of the second Reconstruction.
Yeah. Well, and laziness can be on both sides. I mean, the Republicans just get sort of, the Democrats aren't doing their jobs, and we can kind of keep getting away with this in essence. I mean, I think you get one thing I know, and I have some connections in the Latino community, certainly Mexican Americans. They tend to be more, socially conservative than the average, certainly these days, the average Democratic voter. And this kind of gets to a point of something that is very, very topical now, certainly here in the UK, after the election results of last week, where the Conservative Party won seats they had never won or hadn't won in over 100 years in working class areas, especially up north. In reference to something you said earlier, I mean, I've got the Democracy Index here from the Economist Intelligence Unit in 2016, which is the B2B publishing arm of The Economist. My former employer, I have to be upfront about that, and also I am a freelance contributor, so there is a little skin in the game here. But they were titled it "Revenge of the Deplorables," and refers to the popular revolt in 2016 against political elites who are perceived by many to be out of touch and failing to represent the interests of ordinary people. In that same year, they also downgraded the U.S. from full democracy to flawed democracy. Now, I think, how does this is quite a I hate to use this expression, but quite a cocktail that we have what's happening here, what you're discussing, which is happening racially. But at the same time, we've got a working in both, I would say, both certainly in the UK, but and in the US, of a working class that feels left behind and is just looking for a change of some sort. And whether it be in 2016, it meant voting for Trump for many of them. Do you have a view on how that is playing out and how it could continue playing out?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I look at in history that I think is perhaps instructive for this period is looking at that decade at the end of the 19th century where there was this kind of multiracial populism which existed. And I think that period of American history is not well known and is poorly understood, but I think in many ways could be very instructive for a more positive future out of this dilemma, that it was a way in which you could have, this was the 1890s was a decade when white farmers were experiencing a huge economic dislocation. And in some American states, they realized that they had more in common with the African American tenant farmers than they did with the the business elite, and they teamed up together, and there were pockets of success. And I think that what I would encourage for this current moment is not to necessarily look at people's reaction against, or people's sense of dislocation from elites and the economic system as inherently tied up with racial animus. That I think that there is a way, actually, that non-white communities have felt that dislocation for a very long time, and in some ways white communities have kind of caught up. And there is a potential political alliance there that could be formed under the right leadership. I'm not entirely sure that leadership is visible. Well,
since all the leadership seems to be over 73, or I think it's hard to see who this next generation is going to be. But yes, I agree with you. I think there's a real. It's always been the potential. Yeah. I think people who've looked at these things have always thought, well, these are two groups of certainly in the U.S., a population that have in some ways more in common than the elites that have been, I hate to put it this way, but leading them, basically. Yeah. I think what I'm going to suggest is that we actually let James Baldwin have the last word on this, since he's so eloquent. Yeah. And there's a clip where, at the very end, where he basically says, just Americans need to stop worrying about numbers. And I think Chase Manhattan Bank is, I guess I'm not supposed to say that, but he mentions that. I can report that that's what he says. And that we need less numbers and more passion. So on that note, I'm not going to say anything else except to thank our guest for coming on to the show. It's been a pleasure. I think this is going to be a very eventful year coming up. If you're up for it, we'd love to have you on again as we get closer to certainly the November election. For those our listeners, how would they? What's the best way to follow you? What's your Twitter handle? Because I thought you have I really enjoyed your Twitter feed. I'm on Twitter, Richard Mark J. That's Mark spelled M-A-R-C. Okay, and if they're the book, it's coming out June 2020. June 2020. Yeah. Is it Polity? Polity Press. Yeah. Okay. So let me thank our listeners. Please remember to like us and share us with your friends and family wherever you happen to listen to podcasts. This is Factual America, signing off.
You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guest, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Alamo Pictures to be the first to hear about new productions, festivals we're attending, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.